You're listening to In the Balance, the Iowa Judicial Branch podcast. Welcome to In the Balance, a podcast dedicated to exploring Iowa Judicial Branch, and I'm your host, Abhash Shrestha. Today, we're talking about women pioneers of the Iowa Judicial Branch. Our guest is Dr. Roxann Ryan. Dr. Ryan began practicing in the Iowa Attorney General Criminal Appeal Division in 1980 and has been involved with numerous state agencies and legal associations. She is also adjunct instructor at Drake Law School, Simpson College, and University of Northern Iowa. Welcome to In the Balance, Dr. Ryan.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you too. So, when you began your practicing law in 1980s, there were just a handful of female judges. What was the climate then for seeing female judges in a bench?
Well, when I started law school in 1977, that was the first year that we had more than 20% women in the law school class, which was notable at the time. And so, not surprisingly, we did not have very many female judges. We also did not have very many female lawyers. And usually it takes a while to gain some experience as a lawyer before you become a judge. So it was fairly rare to see female judges. And the difference between 1980 and today is like night and day.
Huh.
We just see so many more women attorneys and many more women judges than we did. I think when I first began practicing in 1980, there were just a handful of women judges at the district court level, and there was one female judge on the Court of Appeals at the time that I started practicing in 1980. So it was unusual to see women on the bench, certainly. I was able to practice in the Attorney General's office where we had a much higher percentage of women than you saw in most other places in the legal profession. It still was not anywhere close to 50%, but there were a lot more women, and we had women in supervisory positions. So I kind of felt like I was in a very special place as a female attorney because there were so many other women attorneys that I was working with on a day-to-day basis. The Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court was very supportive of women. His wife was a lawyer, so I think he understood some of the challenges that women faced in the legal profession, and so it changed the experience that I had when I was doing appeals. I just felt like I was supported in the workplace where there were a lot of women who were taken seriously and highly respected, and most of my cases were in the Court of Appeals and the Iowa Supreme Court, where women were treated with respect and taken seriously. So I kind of was in a special place, it felt like, when I first started practicing.
And when you were attorneys and when you were seeing judges, female judges be on the bench, how was the interactions with other attorneys seeing a female judge?
For some attorneys, I think it was such a different experience for them that they weren't really quite sure how to respond. On the other hand, it was clear that the women who were serving, certainly on the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, were very well respected by the other judges and justices. And generally speaking, lawyers are going to show respect for judges anyway. So I think there were a lot of challenges for women judges who did not have a lot of peers that they could kind of compare experiences or talk about some of the frustrations that they had. And I heard from some of the judges, particularly some of the district court level judges, that they did not feel that they regularly got the same degree of respect that the male judges would receive from the lawyers who appeared before them.
And since then, with the increased number of female judges throughout the state, how has the change been from your observation?
It's very different now than it was in 1980. There are a whole lot more women, and many of the women have been serving as judges for a long period of time. And And so people are just much more accustomed to seeing women judges presiding over cases and making important decisions. Sometimes I think the litigants are not as accustomed to seeing women in black robes making decisions. Um, but the lawyers, I think, um, have become very accepting of women judges and women attorneys as well. We're seeing a lot more women attorneys practicing throughout the state, not as many in rural areas as in the more populated areas, but even in the rural areas, it's pretty common to see women lawyers and also women judges. So for the lawyers, it has become much more normal in their experiences.
Definitely. Could you share some stories of female pioneers on the bench who motivated you or might motivate others to apply for judicial vacancies?
That's really a common impetus for women lawyers to apply to be judges. They see women on the bench and think, I could do that too. It's it is encouraging for women to see faces, people who look like them on the bench. Um, what interestingly, one of the things that I found made a big difference in my experience was Chief Justice Reynoldson,
Hmm.
because he was very supportive of women lawyers and women judges. He was married to a lawyer, and so he understood some of the challenges that women lawyers face because she had been a woman lawyer at a time when there were really not very many women lawyers at all. And so he was very, very supportive of increasing the number of women lawyers and especially increasing the number of women judges. And in the Attorney General's office, we had I think, the highest percentage of women in any law firm in the state. So I worked every day in a very positive environment. And then I would go and argue cases in the Iowa Supreme Court and the Iowa Court of Appeals. There was already a female judge on the Court of Appeals when I started practicing. So I felt like it was very comfortable to be a female lawyer and
Mhm.
to see female judges. For people who did not have that kind of experience, I think it was especially important for them to be able to see women in robes making decisions and to see men who recognize the value of having diversity on the bench. Um, and that did not happen universally in the district courts around the state. But in the appellate courts, there was a great deal of support for women lawyers and women judges.
Hmm.
And that often would set the tone for lawyers who were going to be appearing in the appellate courts. Um, they would they would go back home with a slightly different attitude.
Definitely. Seeing somebody that represents you in a position with the robe making decision in the bench is always inspiring. So I wanted to know, what did you feel when you heard Marsha Turnus was named the first female Chief Justice of Iowa Supreme Court?
Well, that was also a thrill. Each time that we added a new female judge, it just made me feel better because I've been working for a long time to try and increase the number of women on the bench. Um, Unfortunately, when it came to her election as Chief Justice, I wasn't practicing in the Attorney General's office anymore, so I was not appearing regularly in front of the court the way that I had before. She certainly, I saw her regularly when before she became the Chief Justice. And I always found it heartening to see a variety of different people on the bench. And it was especially good to see women on the bench because I had made a lot of efforts to try and increase the number of women who were interested in being judges and did successfully become judges. So when she was um, elected by her peers to be the Chief Justice, that seemed like very substantial milestone for
Substantial
women
indeed.
lawyers and women judges.
And you recently presented a program for attorneys called Women in Law, Past, Present, and Future. Were you surprised by what you discovered in your research?
Not really, but mainly because I've been working in this arena for so long that there are not a lot of new surprises. It's always interesting for me to hear the insights from people who have had different life paths,
Mhm.
and so it was interesting to hear uh, from genuine pioneers who were often the only woman in the room, the only woman in the county who was practicing law, or the first female judge, because being the first is always a challenge.
Mhm.
And seeing some of the changes over time has been heartening, uh, to see that women are expected to be there in the courtroom as lawyers and as judges. We still see some reluctance to accept
Mhm.
women lawyers and judges, but what used to be very common concerns about whether women should be lawyers or judges has has certainly declined to the point that if someone is expressing that view today, it is very clearly a minority view,
Mhm.
and most lawyers are going to look at those kinds of comments with great skepticism.
What kind of trend did you see in the courtrooms regarding changes in the culture and tradition for the women in the professions since you began working as an attorney?
Well, there have been some big changes, and most of them have happened gradually. Um, a large part of it is just having people go to law school. And so when my class broke that 20% barrier, and we had 20% women instead of 2%
Mhm.
in the law school class, law students see women on a regular basis. When they're in law school, they begin to think about lawyers as including both men and women. And so the women law students and lawyers really strongly encouraged far more women to consider going to law school because just having those numbers makes a difference. Seeing women on a regular basis makes it seem more normal to have women there. And once we passed that 20% threshold,
Mhm.
it continued to grow faster. And that was true nationwide. And if you're going to be talking about judges, most judges have a pretty fair amount of experience before they're appointed to the bench. So you need to have a larger group of people to choose from. You can't put every woman lawyer on the bench.
Yeah.
That it just doesn't work that way. Not everybody wants to be a lawyer or wants to be a judge, and so it takes a while for women to be able to develop their reputation as a lawyer, and to meet people and allow people to understand that they could be a good decision maker and exercise their discretion in responsible ways and come across as person in authority who
Mhm.
should be heard by litigants and by lawyers. And I think the initial progress was very slow,
Mhm.
um, and female judges were incredibly rare, particularly at the district court level. Um, and most of the time, the tradition has been that you get some experience as a trial judge first before you move to the appellate court. So it's not surprising, given our standard expectations for lawyers and judges. It's not at all surprising that it has been a slow growth kind of progress to see more women serving as judges. We're now at the point where we're seeing about half of the law school classes are women.
Yeah.
So in another 10 years, when they have more experience as lawyers, they may be considered more seriously for a judicial position. So I think we're likely to see that lag in time in terms of how many women are going to law school, how many women are practicing law, and how many women are becoming judges.
That's amazing. So you have played an active role in various bar associations to educate women lawyers and provide trainings for female attorneys interested in becoming judges. What motivates you to pursue your work in this field?
I think the primary motivation was that when I realized in talking with other women lawyers how lucky I was to be in a job where women were welcomed and respected in my workplace, and then also when I was arguing cases in the Supreme Court and Court of Appeals, um, I just kind of took that for granted because that was the only experience that I'd had. And when I started talking with other women lawyers, and I realized they didn't have those advantages, and yet they were doing amazing things. Um, that's when I thought, well, I'm in a position where I can probably help to make a difference in other people's lives because I don't have a lot of drama to address in my own job, and there are a lot of things that I would be able to do that I liked doing that would also benefit other women who had very different challenges that they were facing in their practice.
How much progress have you seen in the representation of women in the field of law, and how much more do you think is needed?
I've seen a lot of change, a whole lot of change. Um, and I think there's always going to be a need for change. The world changes, and we should be changing with that. And it sometimes it has to do with gender, and sometimes it has to do with a lot of other factors as well. Um, in fact, right now, I think we're seeing, generally speaking, in society and in the legal profession, a much greater focus on identifying problems and working on prevention so that we may see fewer problems or more manageable problems
Mm.
in the future. And we're seeing that in research as well, that we're starting to look at what's causing all of the problems, and how can we reduce the problems so that they are more manageable.
For all of the people who are your students, I know they feel lucky to have you as a teacher, but for people who are not your students and they want to learn about women and their progress, where would you suggest resources for the people to learn about the history of various women's pioneers in Iowa Judicial Branch? Where would you recommend they start?
Well, actually, for the Bar Association's 150th anniversary, they have archived all of the information that they collected
Hmm.
in preparation for the big celebration that we had at the annual meeting. So if you go to the Iowa State Bar Association website, you can Google archives, and it will take you to the archive, and you can see the information that we've gathered about women lawyers and women judges. So there's a very long PowerPoint that goes through all kinds of different progress that we've seen. There's some quizzes that turned out to be very popular, um, and it's a good overview of kind of progress that we've seen. If you have people who are really serious about research, the Women's Archives at the University of Iowa is just a gold mine of information about women, and particularly women attorneys and women judges. A lot of women have donated their papers to the Women's Archives, and the researchers at the archives also have expanded on some of that information. Um, they don't have very much information online, but if you want to make a personal trip to the University of Iowa, spending a little bit of time in the archives is a great way to learn a whole lot more about women in Iowa.
Awesome. And during your research for the presentation for Iowa State Bar Association, could you say a few things that was really interesting, something that could inspire you or our audience?
One of the things that surprised me, and I was alive during this time, But one of the things that surprised me was the legal advances that we saw for women, just in terms of the law. It, so much of it happened later than I realized that it happened. So it wasn't until the 1970s that that the U.S. Supreme Court said that you could not prohibit women from serving on juries. It wasn't until the 1970s that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was interpreted to say you cannot advertise jobs specifically for women or specifically for men. You should be hiring people who can do the job, regardless of gender. Women did not have the right to their own credit scores, their own credit cards until the 1980s. So it was, well, I take that back. It was the late 70s, but it really didn't catch on until the 1980s. And many of those things I just thought were well established long before that. So there are a lot of very, very slow implementation of legal changes. Um, and there are still, I still hear stories from lawyers about widows who have no credit score at all because they've never had assets in their own name until their spouse died. So I think we see a lot of legal changes that don't always translate into real life experiences for people. And I hope that as we become more aware of some of those shortcomings, that we can find ways to reach the people who need to take advantage of those long-standing legal changes that can make a big difference for them at important points in their lives.
Yeah, just thinking about 1980s, this could have happened a long time ago, but that's not very long ago at all.
I'm much older, but I agree. That was not that long ago. I
Well, I'm
thought I thought we'd made progress long before that.
I'm really certain hope all of the progress and hopefully every man, woman, everybody gets to enjoy living as equals and striving with respect and equality. Thank you, Dr. Ryan, for providing inspirational information about Iowa's history of women pioneers in Iowa Judicial Branch. I know our audience are really appreciative of your knowledge you provided us. Well, thank you all for tuning to our podcast. We'll return next month with another informative topic. Until then, thank you for listening to In the Balance.